Welcome everybody to our event to discuss this timely new book called System Error, Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot. I am Judith Kelly, Dean of the Stanford School of Public Policy. And I want to start by thanking Duke Science and Society for their collaboration. They're such great partners for the Stanford School here on campus, and they have put on this event and is staffing it today. So thank you to them. Our collaboration with Science and Society is really emblematic of the type of interdisciplinary approach that we take at Duke to asking big questions like the ones we're going to talk about today, and similar to the approach that the authors we're going to meet today themselves are taking and asking questions in a very interdisciplinary way. At Science and Society, they offer programs that are geared towards answering and probing some of the questions we'll be talking today. They have a master's in bioethics, tech ethics, and science policy, and they also have a number of great technology programs for undergraduate students. And at the Stanford School, our mission really is to probe hard questions like this, to figure out how we can make true contributions to society by thinking about hard problems and how to solve them, especially the ones that are intersecting with issues like democracy, like today's topic certainly is. Our program at the Stanford School, we have a master's that has a concentration in tech policy. We have a tech policy lab, and lots of ways we are engaging undergraduates in hands-on ways to think about these kinds of issues. And a new thing that we're doing at the Stanford School is launching a technology platform accountability project. And that's really about how we can focus on what is required to provide governance structures really for these platforms in ways that allow them to function and deliver the benefits they are able to deliver, but also holding them accountable. We know they can create harm to individuals. They can engage in anti-competitive behavior. They can be destabilizing to democracy. So what really are some of the solutions to these things? And that's what we are focusing our research on. How can we hold companies accountable for having responsible data governance policies and robust cybersecurity policies? And how can companies themselves demonstrate whether they have put in place the people and the policies and the processes to be responsible? And that's really critical research and questions for us as it is for all of society. And they require an interdisciplinary approach: law, ethics, public policy, and definitely technical expertise. And it's only really when we combine those skills that we have the best chance of delivering good answers and good solutions to this problem. So that's why we like to collaborate with Science and Society. That's like we're excited about inviting the authors that we are inviting here today to discuss some of these issues. And I'm particularly excited about the reboot part of the title and how we can think about what we might be able to do about this. So thank you all again for joining us this event. And I hope that you'll reach out to us here at Duke and hear about more about the things you can get involved. If you get excited about this talk, there are lots of ways you can get involved across Duke, and certainly Science and Society and the Stanford School. So it's now my pleasure to turn the events over to Duke professor and world-renowned privacy expert, Jolyn Dellinger. And she's going to introduce the authors of the book that we'll be discussing today. So take it away, Jolyn.
So actually, I'm going to introduce the speakers. I'm Walter Sennett Armstrong.
Take it away, Walter. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Dean Kelly.
That was a system error, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm in the Keenan Institute for Ethics and the Philosophy Department at Duke. My co-moderator, Jolyn Dellinger, is the Stephen and Janet Baer Visiting Lecturer at the Keenan Institute for Ethics and Duke Law School. We're here to discuss this wonderful new book, which has 3 authors. Rob Reich is a philosopher who's director of Stanford's Center for AI for Ethics in Society, co-director of Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. And I want to add, he's also chair of the board of Giving Tuesday, which is a great endeavor. And I want to thank Rob for his efforts on that. Mehran Sahami is a professor of computer science at Stanford. He worked for Google in its infancy and was one of the inventors of spam filters for email. Again, I want to thank you for your work on that. And Jeremy Weinstein is a professor of political science at Stanford, leads the Stanford Impacts Lab, worked in the Obama administration and launched Obama's Open Government Partnership, which again, we all benefit from. So thank you for all of those things, in addition to this wonderful book. The plan for today is that Jolynn and I will alternate questions about the book, give them a chance to respond until about 12:45, and then you, the audience, get to ask your own questions. Please enter your questions into the Q&A function in Zoom, not into the chat, because we'll be taking questions from the Q&A function. So Jolynn, you get to ask the first question.
Okay, great. Thanks. Love to have all the authors join us here on the screen. Thank you, Dean Kelly. And I'd love to just jump right in to some of the great topics that you all cover. In particular, the meaning of the term optimization. You talk a lot about that, particularly as a drive toward maximization of efficiency and its relevance to technologists and engineers. Not just as a tool in the toolbox you all mentioned, but also increasingly as a professional mindset and an orientation toward life. You illuminate the ways that optimizing for efficiency can actually jeopardize or compromise other important values that may be less quantifiable, like privacy, that I care a lot about, like fairness and autonomy. So I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the dangers of this optimization mindset. And Mehran, in particular to you, I'm interested in the implications of this approach for educators and for education in the areas of engineering and computer science in particular. And then for any of you, addressing some of the problems that this optimizing for efficiency can create for social and political problem solving. Mehran, can I turn to you first for advice on education?
Sure. Well, thanks, Jolynn and Walter and Dean Kelly for having us. It's really wonderful to be here. And I see lots of familiar faces actually in the participants panel. So it's also wonderful to see some friends joining us. In order to start, I know that Rob and Jeremy have some additional thoughts on this as well, but to think about the notion of optimization, it's an idea that permeates engineering and computer science specifically, which is the notion of being able to measure something and improve it over time. And in the business world, this translates into finding particular metrics, say, to measure the health of a business and try to be able to improve them. And these go by various names in the business world, things like key performance indicators or objectives and key results. And the idea behind doing this is to try to see if you can measure how the business is doing and do better over time. But the problem arises because certain things that get measured are not always in line with, say, what a company's stated mission is. So, for example, if you consider Facebook, the notion there is to connect the world. Well, what does it mean to connect the world? The way that gets translated into what they actually measure are things like the amount of time people spend on the platform, click-through rates on a piece of content, what kind of reactions people give to a piece of content. And the problem there is just because you interact with a piece of content doesn't mean you're actually creating more connection or you're actually happier with the time you're spending on platform. You could be clicking on misinformation because someone is trying to influence your behavior. You could be interacting with a piece of content because it actually is upsetting to you or you find it titillating. It doesn't necessarily mean you're creating greater sense of connection. But when those things happen at scale, we get a greater divergence between the things we're trying to measure and optimize and really what the stated mission of the company is. And that's where some of the problems actually begin to arise. But I'll turn it over to Rob because I know he has some more views on this idea as well.
Great. I just want to express my gratitude as well to everyone, all the hosts for this. It's a great honor to be able to talk to such an interesting group of people there at Duke and beyond. I'll make a kind of predictable analytical point from my own perspective as a philosopher. And it can be stated very simply, which is that optimization is only a means to accomplish some independent end, or as a computer scientist might put it, to pursue an objective or to try to accomplish an objective function. And as a mere means to an end, optimization can be deployed for bad goals if we don't apply the same type of independent assessment of the worthiness of the end as we do towards the means to accomplish it. So part of our worry, as we express it in the book, is that optimization has a very important role to play within a kind of limited technical domain of problem solving that a computer scientist and earlier decision theorists have been especially accomplished at. But when it becomes a broad outlook about all of society, it leads, we think, into a misunderstanding about some very important other values. So just as we don't think driving as efficiently as we can from point A to point B is always the best thing to do, sometimes we put speed bumps in the road near schools. We want to slow things down. We don't ask juries to find the optimal decision in terms of time. We tell juries, be sure to deliberate and consider all the factors. More generally, the big picture tension for me, at least, is that when you bring an optimization mindset to all of society, you misconstrue, I believe, the very purposes of democracy itself. Democracy is not an institutional arrangement meant to optimize any particular outcome, but rather is a fair process for refereeing the ongoing differences in values and in preferences and ideas among citizens. Its chief characteristic here is the fair representation of the voices of all citizens, not delivering optimal outcomes. And so when you bring this optimization mindset to democracy, the technologist often feels no particular attachment to democracy itself. If we could find a beneficent technocrat to do things better and deliver things more optimally, well, let's go for that. And that's when I, as a democratic theorist, begin to get very nervous. Jeremy, do you want to add anything?
No, let's kick it to the next question. We'll avoid the instinct to have all three of us talk in response to every question. So over to you, Walter and Jolyn.
Okay, so my next question is related to this. What you say is that we need to build this concern with the values that get left out by optimization. We need to build that into, at one point you say, the early design phase of any technology, and into the company's overall operations. But wait a minute, the company is going to say, we've been making billions. You know, this approach works great for our stockholders, for our bank accounts. How are you going to get them to really build these other values into the early design phase of any technology, as you say we should be doing?
So I'll jump in first on this question. And partly we've had exposure to thinking about these issues through the lens of teaching 300 young technologists a year, and also engaging professional technologists around these issues in the evening over the last 3 years. And part of what I'd say is that by giving people a license to think about the values that they encode in technology, the issues that are bubbling just below the surface, that is, to what extent should we optimize for time on the platform versus our concerns about, misinformation and the health of the information ecosystem, or to what extent should we violate people's privacy rights, knowing that there's this asymmetry of power where we understand how their data is being used, but the users themselves don't. Technologists are feeling uncomfortable about the role that they're playing. And so when we talk in the book about the importance of cultivating an ethic of responsibility in tech, it's not because we think that we are painting on a canvas where there isn't already an urgency among people inside companies to grapple with the extraordinary superpowers that are in their own hands. We're trying to give people license to make explicit the values that are being encoded in technology and to think about these trade-offs. Now, Walter, you're absolutely right that as a baseline assumption with respect to the behavior of companies, we can think about companies as sort of maximizing their bottom line, about turning the most effective profits that they possibly can to meet the needs of their shareholders. But companies also exist in an environment where they have reputations. They have to be concerned about the potential impact of regulation, that they have to compete for extraordinary pools of concentrated pools of talent. And so ultimately, it's not as simple as companies are not going to be a vehicle for change in this space. It's a question of how do we animate and incentivize and encourage those conversations to be happening inside companies, recognizing that while regulation has an important role to play, it can't be in every conversation, and it can't be where the frontier is with the respect to the design of new technologies. And so the movement that we see inside tech towards responsible AI, towards ethics, all the way up and down the stack in the product design process is something to be encouraged. And it's consistent with the kind of ethic that we saw evolve in medicine and the life sciences, recognizing that yes, there's a role for government, but the actual producers of these new technologies need to be building a set of norms and practices that govern their own behavior as well.
Mehran or Rob, do you have anything to add, or shall we move on?
I mean, I would just add one thing, which is that despite the strong profit motive, which certainly exists in companies, having been at Google for many years, there were certainly things internally we saw that we could have done to generate more money that we didn't because we drew certain lines. And part of that has to do with how you actually get an understanding and appreciation for what are the other values that are being traded off. As Jeremy mentioned, regulation is one way to do that, but another one is when you understand what are the things you're optimizing, what are the actual measures and metrics and the impacts, the externalities that generates, you can actually have a conversation to figure out how you might measure other things that you would actually think are useful to the larger health of the business and to society, not always just profits. And I've seen it happen in companies. It is possible, but it requires a greater depth of thought than just accepting the measures for what they are and continuing to optimize the same things.
Jolynn?
Well, I am totally on board with the responsibilities of technologists, comp sci, engineering people, thinking about these things at the design phase. But I'm not sure people are worried enough about regulation because perhaps we have not, as a country, given them reason to be worried enough about regulation. So I do want to drill down on that idea. I mean, when you talk about this kind of tug of war, our largely unregulated tech sector, certainly from the privacy perspective, somewhat in the competition perspective, and this tug of war between people seeking growth and profit on the one hand, other people seeking consumer protection and competition on the other hand. And you specifically mention in the book government's complicity to a degree in the absence of regulation here. And so one of the things I wanted you to talk more about, if you can, is specifically the role that the early regulatory distinction between communications on the one hand and information services on the other has played in this regulatory saga, and your ideas about potential fixes for that specific problem that is still descriptive of our system.
So I'll jump in on this first, but I know we all have thoughts on these issues. So Jolynn, you're absolutely right to note coming out of the book, our view that politicians are complicit in the outcomes that we see today. And I think it's a really important point to underline because if you read the headlines, if you follow this from some remove, you would think that the finger is to be pointed at Mark Zuckerberg. The finger is to be pointed at Sergey and Larry. The finger is to be pointed at each of the kind of, this founder worship, CEO of the tech companies moment that we're in, and that they're the ones to blame. And I think, as we outline in the book, explicit decisions were made in the 1990s to craft a regulatory oasis around big tech, to pave the superhighway, the information superhighway explicitly. And part of that paving was to remove, any kind of regulatory constraints largely from the big tech space, in contrast to the large regulatory infrastructure that we built around, say, telecommunications, right? Over almost 100 years from the telegraph up through phones and the like. And of course, what motivated that regulatory oasis at the time was a desire, building on the investments that government had made in creating the internet, to try and incentivize the flows of significant private capital into this new space, and to figure out how to build market mechanisms that would basically drive the growth of the internet and the social media platforms. And that very much may have been the right decision at the moment, right? And we can reflect back on that. I think the challenge that we want to point to is that as evidence of the social harms of technology have become visible over the last decade or the last decade and a half, we haven't seen the necessary pivot in the orientation of the regulatory state to these challenges. And so in every other domain of our life, we think about a set of guardrails that underlie the functioning of effective markets. And of course, this is a story that I need to tell our undergraduates at Stanford in the very libertarian sort of hotbed of Silicon Valley, where they think free markets means free markets and no government, but don't recognize the degree to which government rules and regulations underlie the effective functioning of markets and ensure the safety of products and ensure that we deal with externalities. And we simply haven't had that in the space of big tech. Now, the challenge, of course, is that there isn't one big regulatory play that solves the wide range of social harms that we've seen. You yourself are an expert in privacy, and we need point-specific solutions on privacy that turn frameworks like notice and choice and notice and consent into something that's meaningful, that protects an actual right to privacy, that enables people to take their data from one platform to another. So you can think about point-specific solutions in that space. You can think about point-specific solutions when it comes to addressing issues of content moderation or the implications of AI for the workforce, or even transparency around algorithmic decision-making. We are at a moment where we need to think simultaneously about those point-specific solutions to the harms that are in evidence, but we also need to think more holistically about why it is that we don't have a set of democratic institutions that are capable of governing tech. Because while we know the challenges of today, we don't know the challenges that are going to be imposed by the next frontier technologies. And that requires thinking about reform, not just problem by problem that we've seen today, but really more broadly, what does it mean to have a government that works when it comes to regulating tech?
I just add one additional note to that, Jolyn. Jeremy's already described the history in the US about the purposeful regulatory oasis that was created around Silicon Valley and the paving of the internet superhighway, information superhighway back in the late 90s. I'll put this regulatory point in a kind of bigger picture in my own view, which is that since we believe that engineers are encoding a set of values in any of the products or platforms that they're developing, sometimes quite knowingly and sometimes unknowingly, part of the ambition of our book, and we think of the particular age we live in now, is that the value trade-offs that are being made by the private power of big companies are things that are appropriately put to democratic politics for ultimate resolution, even if only temporarily through regulation. So let's take a concrete example. All of us who are participating in this webinar presumably use end-to-end encrypted messaging platforms, whether it's WhatsApp or Signal or iMessage. So there's this very important and extraordinary technical accomplishment of encrypting messaging so that neither the company nor the government has access to the content of the message. It's a huge win for privacy, so to speak. It's a technical approach that encodes privacy into the very operation. But as Jeremy personally experienced when he was serving in the Obama administration, when the terrorist in the San Bernardino terrorist case is using an iPhone, and after the terrorist incident, the phone is recovered, the FBI would like to get access to the contents of the phone in order to see whether there are further terrorist attacks that might be in planning still. Or more recently, Apple decides it wants to try to scan photos that are uploaded to iCloud in order to see if there are child pornography being shared online. There's a value of national security and a value of personal safety that sit in some tension with the value of individual privacy. And right now, those decisions are being made entirely by the technologists inside companies rather than the democratic process, which is the appropriate forum for refereeing those value tensions. And I'll just point out that this is also where we think an optimization approach comes to some, tension. If you ask a technologist, how do you optimize the trade-off between privacy, safety, and national security? Is there actually a singularly correct optimum that if only we could identify it, we would have the right answer and we could stop thinking about it? Again, that's where we disagree. We think there are better and worse choices in those value trade-offs. And the best process for refereeing those value trade-offs is democracy continually updating along the way, but not that we can find an optimum and then shut our brains off and stop thinking about it.
Mehran, did you want to add anything or?
No, I think if we go to the next question, that'd be great.
Okay. Well, the next question really moves on to a different topic, because the first part of the book talks about the culture of Silicon Valley and the government regulation. The second part looks at some particular applications. So I want to ask a question about fairness in particular. The chapter on fairness really focuses on two main examples, although a lot are discussed. One was hiring at Amazon, and the other is pretrial release, including bail. And sure enough, automated systems for making these decisions have been shown to be unfair, both substantively unfair in terms of bias against African Americans or women in the case of hiring, or procedurally unfair, that they're not transparent enough for people to complain when adverse decisions are made against them. So those are problems. But my question is, are humans any better? When you think back to humans making hiring decisions, that's not transparent, especially in the screening process early on. And are humans biased? Sure. So it seems to me we've got a problem here that, if we reject these artificial intelligence solutions in cases like this, we might end up being worse off because we're going back to the old system that we know doesn't work. So are humans any better? And secondly, should we put up with a certain level of unfairness under AI because it's better than the alternative?
Well, maybe I'll start here, Walter. I think you make an excellent point. The important thing to keep in mind is there's this belief that because algorithms might make decisions, they might somehow be more fair than people, or they might be more objective in some sense. And the important thing to realize is in most of the applications of algorithmic decision-making, there's technology called machine learning, which is basically finding patterns in data that's used to build the models that are then deployed to make these decisions. And machine learning basically works by looking at a large volume of prior data. Now, in many of these applications that involve human decision-making in the past, the data that's actually being analyzed is human decision-making. And that means all the biases that might exist in human decision-making are in that data, and they get encoded in the machine learning model because it finds those patterns. Now, the problem is that those biases are now being deployed at scale in these models, which are making these decisions. And moreover, some of the processes that we may have had in place before for challenging the decisions that might have been made by a human decision maker are no longer there, because if you ask the model the same question again with the same inputs, it will give you the same answer. So we've potentially lost some due process while increasing the scale at which human bias is actually being brought to bear on this decision-making process. Now, it's not all bad news. There is good news in there. And as we talked about, for example, in the book with the Amazon resume screening case, human beings are difficult to open their head up and understand what is the bias and what's going on. But with an algorithm, there's the potential to actually do that, to be able to run tests, to understand systematically what kinds of ways it might be producing bias, and then to see whether or not it's possible to actually modify the algorithms or do various kinds of techniques in terms of how you sample the data or gather new data to potentially come up with a model that generates something that's more fair. The two things that become tricky there is what is the definition of fair? As we talked about with the optimization mindset, you need to have a technical definition of what is fairness to optimize that in an algorithm. And that's something that actually runs into difficulty, as we've kind of found there are multiple definitions. One researcher at Princeton, for example, espoused 21 different definitions of fairness that all seem reasonable, but some of which are mathematically incompatible with each other. You try to optimize one, it actually will lower another one. So that's where we need a deliberative process to be able to understand collectively what we believe is fair. And then secondly, the other issue that comes up when we think about this kind of fairness is how do we get the procedural aspect back into it? How do we create the sort of accountability that's necessary and the transparency that we need in the use of algorithms and how they're deployed to allow for a meaningful challenge?
Let me add one thing, Walter, if I can, which is, I think Mehran rightly pushed back against the notion that there's like, unfair humans and fairer algorithms, and we should pick one or the other. That was sort of embedded in the framing of your question, because of course the reality is that algorithms themselves reflect human biases, but also they're embedded in human systems. And an example that we walk through in the book, of course, is these algorithmic decision-making tools around pretrial detention and release. And this got pulled into the live policy debate in California around the end of cash bail. So cash bail was seen as a system that was deeply unfair for lots of reasons. And in the effort to end cash bail, the legislative framework replaced cash bail, a system that discriminates against people who don't have resources, with algorithmic decision-making around pretrial release, on the notion that somehow that system was likely to be fairer than the decisions that judges would make. But without some real understanding of what algorithmic decision-making is, California adopted a framework that decentralized to its 50 counties decision-making on what algorithm to use, right? Or to go even deeper, what notion of fairness to embed, what level of bias and discrimination to accept, what due process provisions to set in place. And all of a sudden, notions of equality under the law go out the window when you're leaving it to 50 plus counties to make decisions about things that they don't have the technical expertise to understand outside of the purview, of voters and a more deliberative process. And so we are not against algorithms, right? We're in a world where algorithms offer us enormous opportunities, but we shouldn't pretend that they're neutral or objective. We shouldn't pretend that they're free of some of the same biases that we see in human decision-making. And we shouldn't pretend that the really fundamental question is, how do we bring together what algorithms provide with human decision-making and allow for conceptions of legitimacy and fairness that are embedded in processes that people can understand and accept? And that's the frontier that we need to figure out. And you can't leave that to the technologists alone.
I totally agree about that. Let me just ask about this different conceptions of fairness, though, because when a judge makes a decision about whether to grant somebody bail, I have no idea what conception of fairness they're using. And the attempt to build it into an AI system actually forces us to think more deeply about what the relevant notion of fairness is in a way that we would not get from judges. And so it's not clear that the attempt to put it into AI is creating a problem or an opportunity to have this discussion. I agree with you, we got to have the discussion, but with judges, we never even had that discussion.
Yeah, let me hop in here. You make, of course, an excellent point, and I've heard Mehran sometimes in teaching give exactly that point with the following idea. One reason to have some prospective positive orientation to algorithmic models here is that, just as you say, Walter, you can't open a judge's head and inspect the decision making in any way. We talk sometimes about the lack of explainability in AI or in algorithmic models, but often that's equally so, if not more so, in human beings. You can't discern the reasons that a person's using unless we afford them a process for delivering those reasons, which I'll note sometimes does happen in the case of judges. So part of the point of our class together, and indeed the book, is to take advantage of exactly what you just said. By using these algorithmic models, we're forced to try to give some specification to what fairness means. And rather than just rely upon the intuitive or implicit expectations of what fairness ought to be from the technologist, let's indeed bring to bear the resources of a philosopher, the resources of a policymaker, people in the law, and the technologists, so that we can be quite more explicit about what notions of fairness we wish to build in and how they might be defended to accommodate the views of a wider population to whom these technologists are properly accountable in what they build.
Good, thanks. Jolynn?
Well, so we've talked about what technologists are doing, design and implementation. We've talked some about government. And I just want to bring a little bit of attention to the degree, Jeremy, you were mentioning our notice and consent system, at least when it comes to privacy, the degree to which in our current system, the onus is on consumers to wade through and navigate the situation and figure out where they want to give their data, where they don't. And so I like in your book, you characterize this notice and choice kind of as a void, a place where we feel as if we have some control, but really not so much. And so from the reboot perspective, if notice and consent has the problems that you describe, and which I agree with, what is the reboot there? What's the alternative? What are specifics that you all are recommending to improve that particular system and take some of the onus off of consumers to be trying to navigate the situation on their own?
So we can think about both policy and technology in this space. Policy, in some sense, the path, it is already laid with the leadership of the European Union in creating the Generalized Data Protection Regulation, in California with the California Consumer Privacy Act. In Europe, what you see is a presumption that there is a right to privacy, which is something that, is not fully embodied in the US framework. Yes, we have some autonomy and liberty for us to make these decisions, but with this tremendous asymmetry of power. And so the European framework leans in a lot further, as you well know, in guaranteeing for individuals, the ability to not only know how their data is being used and requiring affirmative consent for end users, but also to delete their data, to take their data with them, recognizing that this is really something that should be invested in the hands of the individual that's generating this data. And of course, the CCPA in California attempts to bring some of these regulatory frameworks to bear, in the US context, but we've not seen that at the federal level in the United States. And so that's an obvious sort of first place for this conversation to unfold. But this issue of asymmetry, this issue of the fact that individuals, when it comes to managing and engaging platforms, really don't have the knowledge, don't have the cognitive, framework, the capability to make these judgments, can't even imagine the end uses that technologies might be deployed for, really gets to the root of the problem, which is as long as we're in a world in which you're being asked, but you don't really understand, there are real constraints. And that means, on the one hand, trying to bring down the costs dramatically of people turning their privacy preferences into privacy behaviors. So we think about the privacy paradox that we talk about in the book. So what if there was a single platform that you went to where you communicated in very simple ways your comfort and discomfort with respect to your use of personal data on the web, and every platform, every app was required to hew to your preferences? That would be an entirely different technological or technical model for dealing with privacy preferences. But then we also have to think about whether there are particular end uses, of people's personal data that need to be forbidden and constrained. And this is a kind of conversation that we simply aren't having. We've simply accepted that the liberty and autonomy that's guaranteed in notice and choice, or notice and consent, somehow honors, the value that we put on privacy as a society. And part of what we're pointing to is just there's a profound disconnect in there. Let's stop pretending that we actually have a lot of autonomy. And we always go through this exercise with our students, like, raise your hand if you're really concerned about privacy. All the hands go up. keep your hand up if you ever change the privacy settings on an application. All the hands go down, right? And so, that's at the core of the privacy paradox, and we haven't designed a system that is responsive to the realities of that privacy paradox.
Rob, Mehran, you have anything to add?
No, not now.
I mean, one
Okay.
thing I would add is Jeremy talks about the solution where you could have one set of privacy settings. And that's something that is both technologically feasible and we've actually seen prototypes for. We had a student do that, and she was concerned with the privacy rights of domestic abuse survivors, right? And so her point was, people spend a bunch of time online. Why should someone who privacy has an extreme value for them have to go and figure out all these broke settings in different apps? So she actually built this. She built an interface where you would, in sensible language, set some privacy settings around what you're comfortable sharing, what you're not. And then she was the one who actually figured out the wiring to a bunch of different common apps to set their privacy settings in line with what you would set in this interface. Well, why do we have to have a student in our class generate that? That seems like such a valuable thing that you would actually want it in place for all companies to have to respect, and an interface that's actually maintained in some reasonable way. So technologically, we can actually generate those solutions. We need to have a will as a society to actually say that we need to require this of the companies.
I would tell you that privacy innovation is my very favorite kind of innovation, and I love to hear that story. Thanks for that. Walter?
So I want to make sure we leave enough time for the audience to ask their questions. So first of all, let me remind the audience that you should enter your questions in the Q&A function. We already have a bunch of them there, and we will start going through those after I ask my last question, which is really kind of a speed round question for each of the authors. What do you think is the single most important take-home lesson from your book? And I mean one, don't cheat. This is a speed round. What's the biggest take-home message? And the person who goes first doesn't have to worry about repeating the others.
I'll start, jumped in, speed round. It's all about democracy. And to add 2 sentences beyond that, we have been in a position over the last 25 years where we have trusted the development of technology and the effects of technology on society to technologists themselves, believing that it's too complex for us to access, accepting sort of general broad, bland statements about their social change orientation and their desire to benefit everyone positively through the technologies that they create, and that politicians have gotten on board with basically, abstaining from leadership in this space. And if we're frustrated with these outcomes, yes, you can point fingers at tech companies, but ultimately it's a failure of our democratic institutions to recognize their rightful role and to take on their responsibility of setting in place the relevant regulatory guardrails. We do that in every other market, and it's time to do it in tech, but it's only going to happen if we as citizens incentivize our politicians to focus on this issue at the top of their agenda.
Mehran, go ahead. I'll go last.
So I'd say the big issue for me is this is not a matter of good or bad people or good or bad companies, although that's what the press might get you to believe, because whenever time they write a story, it's usually the name of some CEO in that story and what they're doing to the world. It's a story about systematic drivers. And if you replace the CEOs in these companies, you would get the same outcomes that we're seeing now, because they're systematic drivers for what's going on. And if we have systematic drivers, what we need are systematic solutions. What we've had in the past is this expectation that this is about individual choices. And the problem is that that individual choice of which app you use or how you set your privacy settings as an individual does not actually address what the systematic drivers are. For that, we need a broader collective decision-making, and that's democracy, as Jeremy talked about.
Great.
All right, and I'll add in a complementary way that in order to power the democratic process that Jeremy and Mehran described, one of the most important message, I think, of the book is that we all have a voice in how to think about shaping our technological future. And rather than believe that technology is akin to a gravitational force that just happens to us and that we can't avoid, we want to lift the agency of every single person to be able to express their views about how to shape a technological future worth having. And one last piece of color, just to give the Silicon Valley version of this, I think we're finally exiting an era in which we have given just extraordinary power and permission to people in Silicon Valley companies or tech companies more generally, initially with this techno-optimism that was going to, these products were going to change the world for the better, unlock human potential, spread freedom and democracy around the world. And then the past 5 years, it's tech pessimism, in which the apology tours of the CEOs were going to work on the problem and fix it. Now we think that's the sort of corrupting democracy from within and hijacking our attention, all good or all bad. We're entering a moment now, a regulatory moment, in which we will be what I would call just mature human beings thinking about this. We have to harness the good, mitigate the bad, and we do that collectively through our own individual voices in a collective process known as democratic decision-making.
Okay, then let's hear from some of those voices by the questions from the audience. Jolene, you said you had a question from the audience you could ask.
Yes, I would love to do that. We're getting several questions regarding education. And so I'd like to combine a couple of questions we have from Michael Faber, who's here at Duke with the CoLabs, and Patrick Murray, who is with Keenan as well. And I just want to raise these 2 points they make. One, do you think that engineers, programmers, software designers should be licensed in some way, similar to doctors and lawyers, and have to have that license renewed with updated tech and potential to lose that license if ethical boundaries are crossed? And Patrick's also addresses the idea of education and talks about whether ethics should be explicitly incorporated into the teaching and training of programmers and engineers. Could you address some of those questions?
I'll jump in first, given that I teach a lot of technologists at Stanford. With respect to the second part, absolutely. The notion of integrating ethics as part of the educational process for engineers, I think, is something that we're seeing more of and will continue to see. We have a project at Stanford called Embedded Ethics, which actually is part of a shared collective with several other universities. And the idea is to weave in ethics modules throughout the computer science curriculum rather than just having them in a separate class, although we think a separate class is still useful. And the way I would liken that to is the notion of when building software, we not only teach students how to program, we also teach students about how to actually test their software. You never deploy a piece of software without testing it. In the same way, one shouldn't think about deploying a piece of software without actually doing some analysis as to what the externalities might be and an understanding of what the negative outcomes could be so that they could be mitigated before releasing that software. That needs to be part of the educational process. With respect to licensing, that's a trickier question because it gets into the notion of what are the prerequisites for licensing. So this issue was actually grappled with by the Association for Computing Machinery, the ACM, back in the early 90s. They put together a panel to look at whether or not software professionals should be licensed. There's actually one state in the United States where they are, it's Texas, and that's only licensing for someone who's an individual contractor, not for software engineers at software companies. But the trickiness there is how do you determine what that license is and what are the right stepping stones for someone to actually get the license. Without going into the details there, that becomes difficult. One could think of, rather than a licensing mechanism in the traditional sense that there's a bunch of exams or whatever you need to do to get the license, one could have a license to be able to develop software revoked should they actually produce software that produces significant enough negative externalities. That avoids the issue of what are the steps you need to get the licensure, but does deal with the issue of who would have the right or the ability to produce software based on the kinds of outcomes they've generated in the past.
One thing I'd just add to the comment about licensing is we just have to recognize that there's something between nothing and licensure, right? And that the kind of evolution and maturing of a set of professional codes and ethics and social norms around what is and isn't acceptable, that needs to be put into overdrive in the tech industry. And we've seen it in the life sciences around the creation of CRISPR. and gene editing technologies, the mobilization of scientists and practitioners to establish standards and expectations. And so there's a lot that you can do even before you tackle this question of is licensure by the state what's required? And I think we're just at the very early moments of seeing that mobilization happen in tech, but it's long overdue.
I'm going to refrain from answering as well. Let's go to another question.
Okay, well, it's my turn to pick a question from the audience from Michael Jones, and maybe this one will go to you, Rob, because he asks, please discuss the potential application of two well-known principles to the tech industry. One, the precautionary principle, now applicable to the pharmaceutical industry, and two, the right to an explanation. I.e., why did the algorithm make the decision it made? Do we have a right to know that? What do you think?
Yeah, good. So these are two principles that are drawn from a wider body of work that I think is not especially well known within the typical engineer's education. And it's important to bring these intersections. So the precautionary principle, the idea that we should try to identify some of the worst case outcomes that might come about and ensure that we're taking serious steps to mitigate or avoid them. And I'm putting it in the most generic sense possible here. Well, part of the diagnosis we offer in the book and the class is that this combination of a kind of build things quickly, move fast and break things, and then married to the venture capital approach to grow, to scale as fast as you can, worry about societal consequences afterwards, lock in your network effects, get your marketplace dominance, and then see what you have to do to mop up any messes you create. Well, that's the entire opposite of the precautionary principle. And that's almost taken, I think, as a kind of article of faith. Even if we didn't have to go all the way towards an official embedding of the precautionary principle in the development of technology, having something widely practiced within the early stage development of technological advances, which sometimes gets called red teaming within tech companies, the idea that you try to anticipate an adversarial actor taking advantage of the tool or the thing that you're building and then mapping out what the consequences might be. That seems to us a kind of bare minimum, and then you could build into greater steps towards a precautionary principle. Right to an explanation is another fantastic and important element here. Any place there's an algorithmic model at use within a public agency or a public, whether it's education, criminal justice, loans, anything of these kinds, we expect that there are due process elements within those domains. And to get due process working, you need some type of explanation about what generated the initial outcome in the first place. You can't have an appeal in a criminal trial unless you have an explanation for what it was that was the decision initially. And so a right to an explanation is an important element as well. And I'll just flag for anybody who's listening as a student or a postdoc, here is with an excellent intersection of where I think really important work is just beginning to happen, that sits at the nexus between people with backgrounds in law, people with backgrounds in philosophy, and particularly here, people who are doing epistemology, looking for philosophy of science or ways in which we establish knowledge, and explanations are part of what that aspiration is. And then, of course, technologists. And these kinds of collisions between people with legal training, people with philosophical and epistemological training, and then people with computer science training, not especially common, and a great frontier of where positive research can be done.
All
right.
Okay, Jolene.
Yeah, so I'll throw out another question to you from our computer science professor here at Duke, Owen Astrachan. In speaking about regulation with respect to telecommunications companies compared to regulation today of big tech, are legislators today able to do this? They can seem to not have as much information as they need about how tech and internet and AI actually work. Is this comparable to where the country mindset legislative abilities were at the time of regulation for telecommunications? In other words, do we have the tech expertise that we need in the places that we need it? to be making the laws that we apparently need.
So let me start with the good news. The good news is that over the last 2.5 years, we've seen a dramatic transformation in the degree to which our legislators broadcast externally a deep understanding of what's happening in tech. It was about 2 years ago when Mark Zuckerberg was hauled before Congress for the very first time and had a very famous interaction with Senator Orrin Hatch, who asked him, if you give away your product for free, how do you make money? And we all laughed uncomfortably, recognizing that the balance of power in society had fundamentally shifted in some way, that for people who care about democracy and the role of oversight and accountability had to be very concerned. 2 years later, 2.5 years later, a pandemic nearly behind us, we've seen a dramatic transformation. The House Judiciary Committee investigation that unfolded over anti-competitive practices in technology, which was bipartisan, that involved diligent interviews and data collection over multiple years, yielded sensible and reasonable legislative proposals and regulatory reforms that speak to many of the core issues that we're talking about, that were endorsed both by Republicans and Democrats, even in a polarized moment. You've got the positioning of people in leadership positions, in the Biden administration, who are some of the luminaries who've been thinking about these issues for over a decade. So we are making this transformation in terms of positioning people who really understand these issues to put them in a position to influence the regulatory process. That said, we have to recognize that when we look at government, we don't see the kind of technical expertise that we need. It's on us. It's on us that we failed to build a democracy that's capable of governing tech. The example that we give in the last chapter of the book is the sad tale of the demise of the Office of Technology Assessment, an institutional body that provided tech expertise to members of Congress that was really the emblematic example of this around the world, that was copied country by country until in 1994, the contract with America eviscerated this technical expertise in the hope of enabling members of Congress to rely on the market for what they think about science, right? Which was basically giving legislators the opportunity to be dependent primarily on lobbyists for the technical information that they needed. So if we care about having a government that's capable of making smart regulatory decisions, we not only need to make reforms to the kind of, federal oversight bodies to enable them to track in technical expertise, but we also need to encourage young technologists to pursue career paths that enable them to pursue the public interest and not only the private interest. That's work that we all need to do together.
Just to add briefly to that, first of all, a shout out to Owen Astrachan. Good to hear you, Owen. And he's a fantastic educator, so Duke is lucky to have him. But the one thing I would add is, as a point example to take a look at, is if you look around what are policy proposals around the Communications Decency Act, Section 230. A couple of years ago, we saw lawmakers throwing its repeal around as though it would solve all of our problems, and it clearly had no conception of how what they were proposing would have any relation to solving any of the problems they talked about. But if you look at some of the proposals now, they get into issues around algorithmic amplification, trying to define what that is. There's a level of nuance and understanding that is far beyond what it was 2 years ago. I don't think the proposals are quite there yet in terms of something that's ready to be voted on that's actually going to get the intended effect, but it shows much more sophistication than it did just a couple of years ago.
Good. Well, I want to end. We've got a couple of minutes left. I want to end with one final question from the audience. This is from Sam Lambda. Do changes within a company and moves towards responsible technology come from the employees? How can the employees, push for change when leadership does not agree? And I'm going to add my own little bit to this. And how does that affect their career trajectory when they start raising these issues that the leaders are not backing?
I'll start there. That's a great question. And, I feel like I experienced a bit of this personally, having taught classes in philosophy now for 20 plus years at Stanford. About 5 years I got a phone call from a former student who went to work at Google and called me with a kind of moral dilemma. He worked in the legal part of Google and found that during the Trump administration, he was being asked to process all kinds of requests from official arms of the government for access to data that Google had on people, and was worried that what he was effectively doing was turning over personal information about a lot of Google users to the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency in order to deport people, and felt complicit in that. What should he do? And we do see that a lot of tech workers are trying to organize in various ways to resist, or at least shape, the use of the technological products that they're responsible for developing and deploying within companies. It could be whether or not, Project Maven at Google, whether the employees feel comfortable having Google make contracts with the US military. Or it could be about the sort of packages that senior employees get who are being accused of sexual assault or harassment. It could be about labor union organizing. And part of what I guess I want to point to here is that I don't think it's possible for anyone from the outside to give a prescription. Here is what a person from inside the company should do in the face of any particular moral dilemma they face, other than to say, you have an extraordinary amount of agency that you can use if you wish, including, of course, doing what Frances Haugen did. You could decide to become a whistleblower, even though that, of course, brings great risks as well. At least one lesson I take from the whistleblower case with Frances Haugen is that Facebook found that it had a lot of potential problems. It hired first-rate people to research the potential problems of the platform. They did their job, presented their findings to senior leadership, and found that it was either ignored or buried. And so it was left for them to do, but to leak in Frances Haugen's case in order to get more attention paid to the issue. That too is an option. It takes a lot of courage, but that's part and parcel of what we mean by saying you have agency. It's not just a matter of you signing on to whatever it is that's decided for you upstairs.
Rob, thank you so much. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Mehran. It's been such a pleasure to host you. And Rob, I think your note is the perfect one to end on, which is about agency, personal agency, agency for us as higher institutions of higher learning, and for us as citizens, that it is time for us to take this into our hands, and that there's vigorous debate about what to do, but certainly not disagreement about the need to do something. And so I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank our guests for coming. I want to thank Science and Society for collaborating with us and putting on this event. And I urge everybody to go out and buy Systemera, and everybody to help us think about how we can reboot safely. Okay, take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thanks for having us.